Morning. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I was delighted, first of all, to learn about this conference through Josh last year. I brought a couple of my Frank Simon editions to read with the band and had a great time, and they were very well received. But what delighted me the most was that I was able to walk into a room, mention the name Frank Simon, and receive a very warm, positive reception from people who actually knew who Frank Simon was. I guarantee you that if you walk into any room full of people in this country, you're not really going to get that reaction. I've shown this and kind of peddled this stuff around to some of the top folks in our profession who really, I can't say, knew who Frank Simon was or what he did or what he contributed. You'll just have to take my word on that. Some pretended to know, pretty obviously, and pretended to be impressed. But man, it's great to be back here in a room full of people who not only know the name Frank Simon, but would appreciate the content of this presentation. When I was at the University of Arizona, one of my other duties as assigned was to be the librarian of the Frank Simon Memorial Library, and you'll hear more about that later. And when I found some marches that Frank Simon himself had composed in the stacks of music that had been gathering dust for decades, I knew I had found my DMA project. So I foolishly and very naively thought, well, you know, this is some really old music, a lot of which is in manuscript form. I will just make some finale scores just so I can, you know, get a sense of how this music is put together and kind of take the project from there. Well, that took untold months and hours of work. I found, I think at minimum about 250 and at most about 600 errors in these handwritten and even pre-published parts. So the project resulted in these 5 performance editions and also a lot about performance practice, which I'd be happy to talk about anytime. This presentation is kind of an overview of Frank Simon, his life and contributions, the archive itself. It doesn't focus so much on the marches, but I mean, again, I could talk for hours. I had to cut myself off at some point. There's an article version of this that's up for publication, so I can't exactly share it with you. However, Chuck was good enough to print it out in anticipation of distributing it here. I can't really do that. It's no longer really my property. However, I do happen to have a stack of them, okay? And if anyone were to happen by the table and grab one, I certainly would not have been the one to give it to you. So if you'd like this in print form, go ahead. But you can't say I gave it to you because I didn't, okay? So I will read part of this presentation because it's full of great quotations, and then we'll talk extemporaneously at the end about the archive itself. Cornetist, composer, and educator Frank Simon, 1889 to 1967, was a pivotal figure in the history of American bands and a famed radio personality. That Simon is largely forgotten is an unfortunate fate for the man who, according to William D. Ravelli, did more to establish the band's rightful status in the world of music than anyone I know. The Frank Simon Memorial Instrumental Library at the University of Arizona contains over 3,400 pieces of music, along with photographs and personal effects. Its holdings include 5 obscure marches composed by Simon, which helped to elucidate how formal, stylistic, and aesthetic elements of the march evolved during the post-Sousa era. Frank Simon was born on November 26, 1889 in Cincinnati, Ohio. The following year, his parents opened Simon's Dry Goods and Notions store in nearby Middletown, a modest suburb on the cusp of becoming a thriving industrial center. At age 11, Simon began cornet lessons with Q.C. Buckles, leader of the Middletown Municipal Band. Simon evinced an aptitude for the instrument and earned a spot in the band after only a few months of study. One of his first performances at the groundbreaking of the American Rolling Mill Company, Armco, plant was particularly auspicious. Nobody present could have foreseen the extent to which Armco would transform the steel industry, the city of Middletown, and the life of Frank Simon. When Buckles left Middletown in 1906, 14-year-old Frank Simon assumed directorship of the band. That year, the band was featured in the pamphlet Middletown in Black and White in a 2-page spread captioned as follows: Bandmaster Simon has brought the band to a high state of musical efficiency, and its services are eagerly sought for parades and public occasions of note. Mr. Simon is a cornet player of rare ability, age 14. Simon continued cornet lessons with William J. Kopp of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, and later with Herman Belstead, formerly of John Philip Sousa's band. Between 1909 and 1914, Simon toured as soloist with Kopp's military band and John C. Weber's Prize Band of America. Simon also performed with the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra under Leopold Stokowski, likely in an auxiliary capacity. In 1914, on Belstead's recommendation, Simon joined Sousa's band as the stand partner of legendary cornetist Herbert L. Clark. 3 years later, upon Clark's retirement, Simon was appointed cornet soloist and assistant conductor. His mastery of the instrument thrilled audiences the world over. Curtis H. Larkin recalls a notoriously difficult solo passage in Sousa's Showing Off Before Company. Quote, "At the close, Simon hit a very high note and held it for a full minute. The immense building was nearly full. Thousands of people were present. How well I remember hearing the ahs and oohs which sounded on all sides. It seemed as if he would never cease playing that extremely high note." There were 66 such encores in Simon's book, and since Sousa would call these from the stage, Simon never knew in advance which encore he would perform. Sousa cornetist Ralph K. Ostrom described Simon's critical role in the band's operations, especially on tour. It was the responsibility of the first chairman, considered assistant leader, to see the band was tuned, and usually conduct the band through 6 to 10 measures in one of Sousa's marches. That was the rehearsal. Sousa would step on the podium, greet the new members, and read through the programs, and inform newer members to seek information from the first chairman of the sections. A band director through and through, that guy. Sousa trusted Simon implicitly and accepted flutist Meredith Willson and soprano Marjorie Moody into his band based solely on Simon's recommendations. Willson, who is probably best remembered for the perennial Broadway favorite The Music Man, never forgot Simon's advocacy on his behalf. "I once wrote a song about 76 trombones being followed by 110 cornets," Willson wrote to Simon. "This is a good time to reveal to you that there was only one cornet all the time. They just sounded like 110 cornets because you were the cornetist." Unfortunately, Simon's tenure ended abruptly in 1920 when he was accused of instigating a strike among Sousa's musicians. Modern scholars, notably Sousa biographer Paul E. Byerly, maintained Simon's innocence. Simon had kept in touch with the musicians and reported on their complaints, Byerly explains, and Sousa mistakenly assumed that he was the ringleader who called the strike. Dejected, but with his professional reputation intact, Simon returned to Middletown. On September 25, 1920, he appeared as soloist with the Zanesville, Ohio band at National Armco Day, an immense carnival day for American Rolling Mill Company employees and their families. His performance convinced Armco's governing board that the Middletown plant needed its own band with Frank Simon as conductor. Simon accepted the offer, and the October 1920 Armco Bulletin ran a call for participants. In February of 1921, the Musical Messenger documented Armco's plan to develop an entire slate of performance opportunities for employees and their families. It is the present plan to develop a band of 40 Armco men, and within a year to increase the membership to 100. During the winter months, an orchestra of men and women will be conducted. Armco's orchestra performed intermittently between 1921 and 1942, when it was rebranded as the Middletown Symphony Orchestra and ultimately disbanded in 2016. Since Armco stipulated that the musicians also be Armco employees, the quality of the band was initially poor. Simon recalled, "It was no bed of roses. The first year nearly caused a nervous breakdown. The results were so discouraging that many a night after rehearsal, I would slink home through streets and alleys, ashamed and bored at what I had to endure, and bewailing the fact that I had lost a position in the world's best band to conduct the world's worst." Still, Simon resolved to turn this aggregation of amateurs into an artistically viable ensemble. His efforts, which included tutoring individual musicians, were soon rewarded. The June 1921 Musical Messenger includes a column praising Simon and the fledgling Armco Band. Quote, "The band, just 6 months young, has been developed by Professor Simon into one of the best, if not the best, industrial band in the state of Ohio. With Simon's well-known ability and bubbling over enthusiasm, Middletown looks forward to the day when the Armco Band will be the greatest industrial band in the country." Simon describes the philosophy that guided his directorship of the Armco Band in the September-October 1922 Armco Bulletin. "Good music should be placed at the disposal of everyone. A musical education should be made possible for those who desire it, and its study should be encouraged generally, not only for its cultural value, but because of its value as an element in civic betterment. Armco bandsmen feel a responsibility for the development and appreciation of good music in our community." I think these days that would be called a mic drop. Small wonder, given this philosophical bent, that Simon would later cite his work in music education as his crowning achievement. In the summer of 1922, the Armco Band recorded 4 albums for the Gannett Company of Richmond, Indiana. They were released the following November with proceeds benefiting the Armco Association. Each contained 2 selections, a march or novelty number, and a cornet solo featuring Simon accompanied by the Armco Band. You can find these online on the Internet Archive. In the ensuing years, the Armco Band acquired an international reputation, appearing across the United States and at the Canadian National Exposition. A congratulatory letter from Zanesville Chamber of Commerce manager Bryce C. Browning reads, "Your ad states that the Armco Band is, quote, America's greatest industrial band. If you are believers in the policy of truth in advertising, it will be necessary for you to remove the word industrial from this statement." In 1929, the Great Depression forced Armco to terminate employees and discontinue sponsorship of the band. At Simon's instigation, executives agreed to form a new 50-piece professional ensemble dedicated solely to radio performances. To this end, Simon was permitted to recruit musicians from Sousa's band, the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, and other organizations of this caliber. The Armco Iron Master program featured musical selections interspersed with advertisements for iron-based products and was heard weekly on NBC-affiliated stations from 1929 to 1939. Its success inspired the composition of original music for the Armco Band, including Ferde Groffet's A Symphony in Steel, Peter Bye's Iron Master March, and Deke Moffat's Swinging the Ingots. These are all in the Simon Library. Variety found the Armco Band praiseworthy, if quaint, but evinced little patience with the advertising segments. A 1936 review reads, "This is the return of an old-timer, with a couple of minutes of dramatized industrial hero glorifying now added. The Armco half-hour is heavy on light, zippy music. People in general, and the non-sophisticates in particular, will probably like it." Another from 1938 calls the program more or less an institutional broadcasting ballyhoo for big business. Simon's, he was Sousa's assistant stick swishers, outfit is very good for its type and far removed from the general classification of brass band. For what it is, it's okay. The Bandmaster magazine was more effusive in its praise for this new incarnation of the Armco Band and its conductor. Quote, "Frank Simon is a dynamic conductor of great breadth of thought. During a tour of the band, an eminent critic likened the playing of the band to that of a great orchestra. Simon possesses the temperament of the great artist without superficial mannerisms, a great human heart, a delightful wit and sense of humor, and an affable, open-hearted manner that makes him known as a prince among fellows." Unfortunately, the Iron Master program was discontinued during World War II as company resources were diverted to support the war effort. As audiences embraced his radio broadcasts, Simon employed his celebrity status in the service of music education. He was a charter member of the American Bandmasters Association, an organization devoted to commissioning original band music from prominent composers and raising artistic standards for bands nationwide. The membership also included Edwin Franco Goldman, Albert Austin Harding, Arthur Pryor, Herbert L. Clark, and Sousa, who was named honorary life president. The Armco Band featured prominently in the American Bandmasters Association's inaugural convention held in Middletown, right here, from March 13th to 16th, 1930. Broadcasting from the convention, Simon proclaimed, "Never before has such an array of distinguished musicians been together." The Musical Observer's report was similarly enthusiastic. With the personnel back of this movement, there is abundant hope that many important improvements will be brought about. There is little question with the present activity among school bands that we are on the brink of an unprecedented band development in America. This gathering also allowed Simon to reconcile with Sousa, who no longer blamed him for the 1920 musician strike. Simon served as president of the American Bandmasters Association from 1935 to 1937. His final address in this capacity emphasized the importance of garnering public support for bands both during and after the Great Depression. "The future challenges us to our best and most heroic efforts," he declared. "During the next few years of economic rehabilitation, we must seize upon every opportunity to make this continent so band-minded that the future of bands will be solidly entrenched against any emergency that might tend to tear down the worthwhile things, of which band music is one." Also in 1930, Simon joined the faculty of the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. 2 years later, he established the instrumental music program, enabling the conservatory to compete with more progressive institutions and likely, Christopher Chaffee speculates, rescuing it from financial ruin. On this occasion, the Bandmaster magazine praised Simon for keeping pace with the prominence of bands in American culture. In 1949, Simon accepted a faculty position at the rival Cincinnati College of Music. 6 years later, the two institutions merged to form the Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music, and in 1962, the College Conservatory of Music officially became part of the University of Cincinnati. Its current reputation as one of the nation's premier schools of music is thus due in large part to Simon's contributions during its formative years. Simon served as guest conductor and contest adjudicator for secondary and university-level bands nationwide and came to value his interactions with students more than anything else in his storied career. Al Hirt, who first played for Simon at New Orleans Jesuit High School, attended the Cincinnati Conservatory and became one of the 20th century's most lauded Dixieland jazz musicians. Another Simon discovery, Eugene Blee, served for 32 years as principal trumpet at the Cincinnati Symphony and as professor at the University of Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music. Simon was committed to continuing Sousa's legacy and in 1951 led the first of his popular Salute to Sousa clinics. During these 4-day workshops, Simon demonstrated authentic performance techniques and spoke on score preparation, Sousa's role in the school band movement, and even aspects of Sousa's personality that informed his compositional technique. These clinics culminated in the 2-volume recording project, Sounds of John Philip Sousa, in collaboration with the American School Band Directors Association. The liner notes for these albums, transcribed from interviews with Simon, constitute the most extensive first-hand documentation of March performance practice. And incidentally, these are available from American School Band Directors Association. In 1955, Simon was diagnosed with emphysema and advised to relocate to a dry climate. He settled in Tucson, Arizona, and reconnected with Jack Lee, director of bands at the University of Arizona, whose career Simon had helped to launch a decade earlier. Lee arranged for Simon to teach trumpet lessons and conduct the university band as his time and health allowed. University of Arizona Band's historian Paul L. Grimes recalls, Dr. Simon never worked with more than 25 music students at one time, including some outside the university, but the band's trumpet section soon began to demonstrate remarkable improvement, I would think. Simon returned to Ohio in 1965 and died in Columbus on January 28, 1967. So, as far as the library itself, I mentioned the 3,400 pieces of music. This is currently in the middle of being cataloged by a professional who does such things. From 1967 until now, they've been stored in boxes literally stacked up to the ceiling of the room I described earlier. Not the most efficient filing system, and we're just now kind of beginning to discover what's in there, which is why when I found these 5 marches by Frank Simon, it was such a big deal to those of us into that kind of thing. But there's also, as you'll see, some other memorabilia. There's another Simon archive at the University of Maryland, which is heavier on the photos and memorabilia. and lighter on the music itself. There's additional materials at the University of Cincinnati, but the archive at Arizona is well named the Memorial Instrumental Library because we have all of the music from a decade's worth of weekly radio broadcasts, and that amounts to about 3,400 pieces of music, as I said earlier. So, as you'll see, the archive contains photographs from all phases of Simon's career, plaques, trophies, and medals commemorating guest conducting experiences. That's what these are. And sheet music, like I said, from a decade of Armco Ironmaster broadcasts. A question that came up the last time I did this presentation was, did Simon transcribe his own music as Sousa did? And the answer is no. These were all published arrangements available at the time. Not as rare, as one might hope. It's not like unearthing, a Sousa archive of 3,400 transcriptions or whatever, but obviously still unique and valuable for many reasons. His honorary doctorate, of which he was most proud, certificate from Kentucky Governor Burt Combs commissioning the Honorable Frank Simon as a Kentucky colonel in 1963. He joins Sanders and others, presumably. Those are the two that I know of with that distinction. I don't know if anyone's from Kentucky, but apparently this is a very big deal. This is quite the honor to receive a commission like this, and it has to be granted by the governor. And the item on the right, which you really can't read, is a letter from the College Band Directors National Association expressing condolences to the Simon family upon his death. So, though most Armco band repertoire lists no longer exist, there are some programs that you can find in Christopher Chaffee's dissertation. But these programs reveal a preference for transcriptions, marches, popular songs, and novelty numbers. So here are the composers in order of how many pieces each one has in the library. These are the most popular composers whose music was performed in transcription by the Armco Band in those 10 years of radio broadcasts. Beethoven tops the list, interestingly enough. You don't see a lot of Beethoven transcriptions for band these days. But Simon, unlike Sousa, his aim was really to educate the public. So he'd have an all Beethoven broadcast, for example, and intersperse it with historical tidbits and whatnot. Sousa's avowed purpose was to entertain, and he would play some of this same music, but for an entirely different reason. So just an interesting list to look at. This is what the average person tuning in on a Sunday afternoon would hear on the radio. And boy, don't we lament those days. And so here, I know it's pretty small, Marches, Novelties, and Popular Song. These are in alphabetical order. Sousa by far wins out as the most popular or frequently played composer. But this is the best I could do, were lists like these, since we don't have a lot of data regarding actual concert programming. The archive also houses Simon's personal set of Sousa marches. You'll see some handwritten notes on these parts that provide primary source evidence of Sousa's habit of waving out sections of the band to enhance dynamic and timbral variety. Here's the first cornet part from Manhattan Beach with pencil annotations. I don't know if you can see. Some of these out first in second, lay out on the first repeat, come in the second time, actually here. So this is well known, that Sousa never performed his marches as written. He didn't want, as he said, every band to sound like the Sousa band. So what he played, to his mind, couldn't possibly match what was published. Or he wouldn't retain proprietary ownership of this music and the way it was played. If you know the Manhattan Beach March, this is actually very revealing. Only a Sousa musician would have known that the introduction is performed mezzo piano with a crescendo to the downbeat of the fourth measure as the tourists approach the bandstand. The final strain begins pianissimo and gradually grows to fortissimo. This is all in piano, in pencil. The reverse effect occurs on the repetition, which begins fortissimo, fades to pianissimo, and that's how the march ends, as the folks process away from the bandstand. So, it is not my purpose here to take you through the individual marches and all the work I did with them. I mean, if you're really interested in that, I can go there at some point, or that could be a future presentation, or you can read what I've written on it. But I'll show you some of the materials I found. The 5 marches, the oldest of which the Cincinnati Post March, written for the Cincinnati Post newspaper in 1931, published by the Fillmore House. Incidentally, I've had numerous requests for these performance editions. I really appreciate that. That's very flattering. They're currently with a lawyer I'm working with to determine copyright and whatnot, because the publication history of these is very, very convoluted. He would frequently publish outside of his house. His wife, who was not a musician, would do the typesetting, which accounts for some of the errors I found. But publishing houses like the Fillmore Music House, that's Henry Fillmore's family, no longer exists. So what do you do with that? You know, you've got to track down, a whole bunch of people. Some exist in manuscript only, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what's hanging that up. And I'd love to make these available as soon as possible, but now is not the time. As you can tell, that one was published. We have the instrumentation list confirms some missing parts and some interesting instrumentation choices like no bass clarinets. For example, the use of the full SATB saxophone section. I got to perform this with the full saxophone section a few years ago. It was pretty thrilling. It's pretty thrilling just to look out in that third row and see all of them kind of dominating there. Here is the Statesman March, written for the Idaho Statesman. You can see a handwritten version, a copyist's version, some inconsistencies. This is an example of the type of stuff I encountered. Inconsistencies in accents. You see marcato accents and standard accents being played together, which doesn't quite make sense. That made it into the final published score. Not to bore you, but this is the kind of stuff you encounter when you go over multiple versions of a piece of music. The annotations written on this one are actually humorous at times. He uses various colors of pens and pencils, so you can tell what was added later and what was written at what time. This is Here Comes the Band. We'll look at this one later. You can see there was a huge issue with legibility in the parts here. You're supposed to play the lower line the first time, and in this clarinet part here, and the upper line the second time. You can't read that. No one can. People have been trying for decades. So my edition clears things like that up. And then The Little Giant. This was written for Jack Lee, who apparently was a mighty man, but small in stature. This was the object of some ridicule between the two men who were very, very good friends. A joke that they had between them when they'd encounter each other in the hallways of the university. Jack Lee, this little guy, would come walking along and Simon would say, "Hail Caesar!" Kind of as, mocking his diminutive presence. I don't know. So he wrote this March of the Little Giant for Jack Lee, for whom he had great affection and respect. This only exists in manuscript. This is about the cleanest copy of any of the parts you'll see. This one we dealt with missing measures, and it was an absolute mess to deal with. This one actually had to be reconstructed in the truest sense of the word. This was composed around 1963, performed once then. Got to speak to a number of people who were involved in that performance, who retained fond memories of it. We performed it off of the manuscript, so legally, in 2019, I believe. That was the second ever performance. And then we read through my edition here last year, which was the third ever airing of that march and the first outside of that building. So this is pretty rare stuff. And I knew everyone in this room would be interested. There are a few minutes. We can take this in any direction you want, because This is absolute tip of the iceberg as far as my research is concerned. But I appreciate your kind attention and interest, and please get a hold of me and we'll stay in touch. And if you were to grab one of these, that's on you.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you.